Well, boils and ghouls, it's your old pal, John Cassier, the voice of the Crypt Keeper. And I want to welcome my good fiends of the Horror Heals podcast. Is horror good for mental wellness? But of course it is. I delight in the delicious deaths of pitiful people on the silver screen. So get ready for a hell of a good time with my new fiends, Corey and Kendall, on the Horror Heals podcast.
Hey there, Horror Heliacs. It's Corey. Welcome back to Horror Heals, where we explore how horror helps us heal and connect in the most unexpected ways. Today, we have an amazing guest, horror comic book writer Jim Ousley. He's the brilliant mind behind Butcher Queen Volume 2, Planet of the Dead, and if you're lucky enough to be at the Days of the Dead Horror Con in Chicago this weekend, you can meet Jim and grab a brand new copy. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Now, full disclosure. I've had the pleasure of working with Jim back in my sketch comedy days with the nonprofits. He performed one of the most ridiculous sketches I ever wrote, Bye-sie Bye! And let me tell you, he absolutely killed it. Jim is as funny as he is talented as a writer, and I know you're going to love hearing his thoughts on horror, comics, and storytelling. So settle in, because this is going to be a fun one.
Hey Jim, welcome to Horror Heals. Listeners, Jim is an Eisner Award-nominated horror comic book writer, but our history actually is on the flip side of that, going into the comedy world. We were in a sketch comedy troupe together a million years ago. That's actually how we met. But and something I think that Kendall and I believe is that there is definitely some gray area between horror and comedy. So
I agree.
Yeah. Jim, let's just go way, way back. Let's talk about where and how you first fell in love with horror.
Yeah, there are a couple things. I remember being a kid and watching Channel 11 in St. Louis. And on Saturdays, they would always show monster movies. They would show Frankenstein or Abbott and Costello Meet Frankenstein or Dracula, things like that. And it was the first time that I watched something where I wanted to kind of crawl into the television and wander around those great old sets, those pre-code Universal horror films. And, when I was in grade school, I was really shy. I stuttered. I was so shy. I think the main thing that I automatically became attached to with a lot of those early horror films was that in each case, the protagonist or the antagonist, depending on your point of view, they were always the odd man out. They were always the ones who were bullied in a sense, not allowed to be themselves or find themselves. And so I really found an automatic kinship with that. And then later when I was a teenager, when I was in high school, where I was also very shy, I remember I fell in with a group of kids who loved horror movies. And I actually worked with them at a local restaurant. And on Saturday nights, we would go back to somebody's house and rent some horror film. And I remember the first one that we rented was A Nightmare on Elm Street. That really sealed the deal for me. You always hear about how bad horror movies are. But it was also, I love the craftsmanship. In a lot of cases, I do loved a lot of the acting that I found. And again, it was always about people who were put upon, who found different ways to deal with those circumstances. And as I got older, of course, I, fell in love with George Romero and his films, his commentary on society, which continues today with Jordan Peele and the like. So it's been a lifelong thing. And I felt the same way about comics as well. All the DC titles, Tomb of Dracula, all those early, not early, but 70s DC titles, I really loved for all those same reasons.
Awesome. Let's talk a little bit about your foray into comic book writing. I'm fascinated because it's an art form that I adore, and I don't think I have any other friends that do.
Oh, wow. So I was always in a lot of bands growing up, and because no one else wanted to write the lyrics, I was always the one who said, I'll do it. I'll go ahead and do it. So I started doing that, which led to working with Playback, which I think you worked for also, a local music magazine, didn't you?
I was associated with Playback. Yeah.
And so from there, I started writing my own stories. And whenever someone asked me about how I got into comics, I always tell them in St. Louis anyway, And I know a lot of other cities have this, but there's a great collective called Engineering Comics. What they do is they meet once a month and they get a bunch of writers together and a bunch of artists together. And it's all ages. The drinking is, you can if you want to, you don't have to. But it's just a night where we all get together and discuss comics. And they publish 2 anthologies a year, and they're themed anthologies. And they pair up artists with writers, and you go from there. And that's really how I learned about the craft of writing comics. And it is quite a bit different than writing the screenplay. Those rules are quite a bit different, But yeah, that's how I got started.
Now, at this stage in your life, were you going to comic book conventions or horror conventions, pop culture conventions yet?
I grew up loving comics. So for me, growing up, it was comics, movies, music, all fighting for my attention constantly. I didn't go like 4 times a year or anything, but there were more localized conventions like Archon and just random sci-fi and horror conventions before they became these big, lucrative franchises, essentially. Yeah, but I did go to them and I loved it. And I think when you go to a comic book convention or a horror convention, the experience, the fandom experience is so much different than it is on social media. I mean, on social media, it's always the loudest people making the most noise, causing the most trouble. But when you meet these folks and fans in real life that don't care about that stuff as much, they're the kindest people in the world. And I'll say, especially horror fans, they're amazing. They're so nice. And I've made so many friends over the years already. It's pretty remarkable.
Yeah, that's something that people seem to be surprised about when I talk about, my love of horror, our love of horror, and just what it's like at these conventions. It's like, you're just around some of the chillest, coolest, nicest people. Yeah, they might have 25 face tattoos and, a million piercings or whatever and 6'5", but they're just like, it's like the sweetest guy you ever meet.
And I see your pictures sometimes too.
Yeah. Yes, I do my own little cosplay style. The conventions, horror conventions are awful. I know.
Every time that he's going to leave, he opens the particular closet that has this collection of there's no other word to use but gaudy, and suits. But it makes me feel good because I know he's really going to enjoy himself, and that others will recognize his artistic side.
Well, literally yesterday, I just found an artist on Etsy who does custom blazers, and I'm going to get the Horror Heels logo like all over some blazers to wear to the cons, because I am a shameless.
That's great. That's so awesome. Yeah.
I think Dragon Con was probably the first like eye-opening experience going to that in college, like the 24-hour a day party, people dressed up, anything goes kind of experience from like, whoa, this is not what I expected at all, and I loved it.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've never been a cosplayer, but I always loved watching cosplayers. I think the closest I came to cosplaying was being Paul Stanley and Gene Simmons at different times for Halloween.
Yes. Well, that's something that you and Kendall definitely have in common. Is Kendall grew up as his, as a kid, he was a huge Kiss dude, which is surprising considering his Southern Baptist upbringing.
Yeah. Actually, it makes total sense considering his Southern Baptist upbringing.
Yeah. Nah.
Good. Well, yeah.
My father would buy the albums and bring them home and say, "Can we not talk about this with your mother?" I mean, it's just one of those things,
That's great, though. That sounds like a pretty cool dad. That's great.
Oh, he was amazing.
That's awesome. That's pretty.
Ace was one of my favorite interviews I've ever done. He's just like, he's no holds barred. Like he'll just lets it all out.
Yeah, that dude has no filter whatsoever. Yeah, I got to meet him at the event that Gene Simmons was doing, actually. And, he is as spacey as, delightfully so, as you hear about, for sure. It's funny.
I remember seeing you post about that. Can you talk about that just for a couple of minutes? Because I'm fascinated. I like those fan interaction events, and this was like a small little group of people, right?
Oh yeah, so there was the Gene Simmons Vault experience, is what it was, and what it was a you get this vault that's got this huge coffee table book and like 12 CDs of unreleased music and demos and really cool stuff. But the fun part, too, was he actually gives it to you. So we went to this place. I forgot the name of the place. It used to be a club called Plush. if you remember that place in St. Louis, but it was on the 4th floor. But yeah, it was a small amount of people because it was a really expensive thing, something I would normally never splurge on, but I did on this. Yeah, he came in, he did like an acoustic thing with a friend of his, question and answer. Then Ace came in and they did an acoustic thing. Gene would walk around with like hors d'oeuvres and serve people hors d'oeuvres and stuff. And it was catered. And then you got 10 or 15 minutes with them in the back room where he gives you your vols and you talk about it. You just hang out for a while. And Ace was there also. For somebody who grew up as a Kiss fan, it was just an incredible experience. And they were both so nice. That was the best part.
Awesome. Sorry for the little sidebar there, but I just when we were talking about Kiss, I remembered that, and I was like, "Oh, this well, like a really cool fan."
Yeah, actually, it's the thing is, so that's kind of tied back to horror because I remember when I was a kid, the first time I saw a picture of them was on my cousin Terry's wall, her bedroom wall, and this was like not so long after they first came out, and she had these black and white pictures on her wall, and I was like, "What the fuck is this? This is some scary shit," and I did not like it. But then I got into it because I saw that the movie Kiss Meets the Phantom of the Park where they fought like animatronic Frankenstein and Dracula and Wolfman. And it kind of tied everything together for me in a way,
That's very cool. And speaking of that, now I want to say you were in a production of Kiss Meets the Phantom, right? Where Magic Smoking Light was.
Yeah. I played the Star Child. Yes. It was a really fun show. And I interviewed Paul Stanley later after that show and told him that we had done that show. And he goes, "Well, hope they had fun."
All right, so let's get back to horror comics. Let's talk a little bit about your title.
Oh, thanks. Yeah. I have a couple self-published comics. They were The Rough and Tumble that I wrote with my friend Oscar Madrid, and a horror anthology called The Dead Palace that I wrote on my own. Ben Sawyer did the artwork. Ben Sawyer took The Dead Palace to San Diego Comic-Con and was pitching it to various publishers. And Red 5 got a copy of it and really liked it, but they wanted to see if they could make it into a series, like the Dead Palace series. And because of the very lengths of the stories, which was by design, it didn't really work as a monthly title. They said, "Well, do you have anything that you can pitch us from the book that you would like to further explore as a series?" And I said, "Oh, yeah, definitely." And they said, "Well, we'll meet again next week and you can tell us about it." So I had a week to come up with the story and the series that I really didn't have an idea of. I did that and we pitched it to them and they liked it. And we did the first Butcher Queen series, which is Butcher Queen Black Star City. That's the volume 1. And then we did Butcher Queen Planet of the Dead. And that collection finally comes out in trade paperback in November, which is really good news. After that, I did the Atonement Bell, which was probably my most personal project, the one I feel the most kind of emotional and tied to. And it just meant so much to me. And the fact that it resonated with people is so rewarding. And it's so nice because I love when people have questions about it. Or I just did a book club recently here at Apotheosis Comics in St. Louis, and they had a bunch of great questions, and we talked about it, and I loved the whole experience so much. And Tyler B. Ruff was the artist on that as well.
Yeah, I mean, I could definitely tell by reading it that this was like, this is definitely a very personal thing for you. Can you just talk a little bit about the origins of the story and
yeah,
how you developed?
Yeah, for sure. So the whole origin of the story, I wrote a screenplay called The Angels of Warwick, and it was it was more of a tone poem than a screenplay in a way. It was very, very personal, and it was so personal that it didn't really communicate a story as such. So I put it away for a few years. It's like, I'll worry about that later. But then after the second Butcher Queen series, I was thinking about my next thing, and I was like, I think my whole problem with that screenplay and that story was that it should be a graphic novel. That seems like the medium that it would work best in, And so I tore up the screenplay. I kept a couple character names, maybe, but I started from scratch. And a lot of the things that inspired it was basically living in St. Louis. And if this gets boring, please let me, and I'll just shut up.
No, please. No, we're good. We're all
couple things. So when you grow up in St. Louis, and this is why I said it in St. Louis, is there's such a sharp racial divide in St. Louis. And a a lot of times these people are in the same place, and it's something that feels like it's never going to go away, no matter what. And that feeling of like confusion because it's so dumb and hopelessness kind of inspired a lot of Atonement Bell. There's a really great book that was published by Walter Johnson a few years ago called The Broken Heart of America. And it talks about St. Louis as being the start of so many of the racial problems we see in the country today. And it's a fascinating book. If you've never read it, give it a shot. It's fantastic. What finally pushed me to sort of focus on the story in the personal way that I did was I went to, a Catholic grade school, a Catholic high school, because of the miracle of social media, I was able to reconnect with a lot of these folks and became so disillusioned and so disappointed on how they had fallen in to this evangelical conservative nonsense, where listen to the Bible, but also ignore the Bible, because we want our prejudices reinforced. And I lost a lot of friends over it. I was, because I don't keep quiet about that stuff. I never have. I don't like it, and I'll fight that stuff tooth and nail until the day that I die. And that includes LGBT, prejudice. If you call it virtue signaling, that's fine. But not my dojo. You know what I mean? I had no patience for it. So that's really what fueled a lot of the story. At the same time, a lot of the horror stuff that I like does have something to say about society and our place in it and how we can make it better. But it also never forgets to be fun. The good stuff anyway. And, you look at like Get Out, or you look at Night of the Living Dead, Dawn of the Dead, things like that. They definitely have something to say, but they're also a lot of fun. So that was sort of like the thread I was trying to weave, in making a fun story that says something.
Just as you were talking, like People Under the Stairs just jumped into my mind, and Wes Craven has always had something to say. He was, but he made it fun.
Right, exactly. And that's the key to it.
But I think that probably is the reason why I was really drawn to Atonement Bells, because, I grew up in St. Louis too and experienced the same cultural divides that you're talking about. And it's interesting because, Kendall and I spent 9 years in the Bay Area, literally right next to Oakland, and Oakland, California is one of my favorite places in the world because it's every culture, is there. We lived in a bubble for 9 years, honestly, but it was a beautiful bubble to live in. And now we're back on the other coast. And I will say that New England probably has some of the same cultural divides that, we experienced in St. Louis for sure.
Yeah, it's
sadly,
it's so disheartening, but because you're a writer as well. And one benefit of having artistic abilities and creative impulses is that we can illuminate the pain, right? We can make these visceral statements about things that bother us and hopefully make people happy as well. I think that like artists in general, whether you're an actor, a writer, or a painter, whatever, you can't trivialize or minimize your importance to the world. I know that like when I wake up every day, the first thing that I think of is what can I make today that somebody can enjoy. And sometimes it's a stupid haiku that I put online, which I'm sure you've seen, or whatever, but at least it's something. At least oh, thank you. I got to send you a book.
Please. And we would be honored if you would write a haiku about this interview experience.
Absolutely. I will. Yeah. It's a good toilet read. My haiku book is.
Going back to horror conventions, I think just what we were talking about, this cultural divide disappears at the horror conventions. And, they're all over the country now. They're in every state. And I don't care where you are. When you're in a horror convention, you don't realize, you don't know what part of the country you're in, because it's everybody is welcome there. And nobody's going to put up with people's prejudices, cultural prejudices. That is not tolerated at a horror convention.
I think the world will be a better place if more people went to these conventions. You're absolutely right about that. And, I'll tell you one thing from doing conventions since, getting with a publisher and having books out. The main thing that I love about conventions is those times when someone comes up to your table and they don't necessarily want to buy anything. They don't necessarily have any kind of agenda. They just want to tell you about the things they love, and It could be somebody like, sometimes it's someone who's very socially awkward, maybe, but they just want somebody to talk to and share their joy with, and just to be able to be there and listen to them and to engage with them and make part of the experience better of that day is the best thing in the world to me. Really, it's the best.
I mean, that is literally why we're, doing this podcast, is because, and Kendall had been pestering me. We got to do a horror podcast. I'm like, there's a million of them. Yeah. What's ours? And I had that moment at a convention, a couple of months ago where it was like, I could see a young man in duress. And as soon as somebody started engaging with him, like that all went away, and he had a friend and he had a huge smile on his face. And that's a place to go where you can feel comfortable striking up a conversation with anybody. And it's just, and you do. I mean, a lot of times you're standing in line, so you might as well have a conversation with about your shared love of horror, and that's why we're doing this.
Yeah, totally. I've never had a bad experience at a convention.
Yeah.
Everybody's always so nice. I hope that continues. I love being part of that experience where you're making somebody feel good about who they are, and they're excited about what you're doing. And it's just the best feeling in the world. It really is what it's all about,
Absolutely. For sure. So I'm going to put you on the spot. Who should we have on as guests on Horror Heels? Who would be like some great gets?
Oh gosh. Well, there are a couple. I would say, Colin Bunn would be a really good one. He's a horror comic writer who's very popular guy. Also very sweet guy, very informed and interesting. He's one of my favorites, actually, as a reader, as a fan. There's also Eric Stanzi, who you might know. He's a St. Louis-based filmmaker. He runs Wicked Pixel and writes and directs his own films. And Jeff Wedding, who is a Nashville-based filmmaker who does the same thing. I have worked with both those guys as an actor, so just up front. But for working with them, I know how nice they are, how intelligent they are as people, and they would also have a lot to offer in the way of the healing elements and capabilities of horror, for sure.
One of the things we're definitely going to do with our website and social media is, talk about, we love indie horror. We love all horror, but we love mainstream. We love indie. We love the old stuff. What jumps into your head immediately when you think about something you've seen recently that really gotcha?
Well, there's a series right now, a comic series by James Tynion called The Deviant. That one is really, really super engrossing and super interesting. And if I gave you any information about it, it would kind of ruin it for you. But I think you guys would both really, really enjoy it.
I think I might have seen something online, because of course my algorithm is full of deviancy.
If you only imagine. No, but it's really good. I guess.
So, anything you can tease that you're working on now that we might be seeing?
Yeah, well, I'm actually working on a new comic series. I can't talk much about it now, except that, like most of my work, it deals with the dynamics of family. And this one is kind of focused on my mom a little bit, memories of her and things of that nature. I just feel silly talking about something as I'm working on it, just because what are the changes, But I'm working on a couple projects now, a couple screenplays, actually, both horror, with a couple of filmmakers that I never thought I would get a chance to work with. And I'm hoping I have something to announce about that soon. So, but I am working.
Oh, yeah, awesome. Jim, you're one of the first names I thought of when, we decided to do this podcast. I knew that you would be awesome, and you were. So thank you for coming on and sharing with
Thanks so much for inviting me. I love, doing stuff like this, especially if it's a friend. And it's so nice to meet you, Kendall, as well. It was really neat to see both of you guys.
Yeah, you too.
What a great conversation with Jim Ousley. It was so awesome to catch up and dive into his creative process. And don't forget, if you're in Chicago this weekend for Days of the Dead, stop by and see Jim, pick up a copy of Butcher Queen Volume 2, Planet of the Dead, and tell him Horror Heels sent ya. A quick note for our regular listeners, we actually recorded this episode in the spring before we started asking all our guests our signature final question. Who is your favorite final person in a horror movie? But we're not going to let Jim off the hook. His pick, and one that I love, especially as we're getting into the holiday season, is Jess from Bob Clark's Black Christmas. It's a deep cut and a fantastic choice. Thanks for tuning in. And if you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and leave us a review. And as always, when someone asks, is horror good for our mental wellness? You answer, of course it is. The Horror Heals podcast is produced and presented by How the Cow Ate the Cabbage, LLC.